Hey friends, Andrea here, and today's video is going to be just a little bit of a glossary of card making terms, or maybe terminology would be appropriate to call this video. It's just a basics video for people who are new to card making, so that way you can become familiar with some of the terms you might see on YouTube videos, or even just the terms that I use in my videos. So that way, when you're trying to refer to something or you're trying to follow along with someone else, you kind of have a better understanding of what they're talking about. And when you're trying to look for materials or purchase materials or use what you already have, you have a better frame of reference. So to start with, a frequently used term when you're doing card making is the size of the card. And in this case, this card is an A2 size card. A2 refers to the exact dimensions of 5.5 by 4.25, 5.5 long or wide by 4.25 short, or I guess maybe this is the width and this is the height. So that's going to be a standard in the US. Card size is an A2 card. So most card makers are going to make cards in this size. You might see people do longer cards or bigger cards, square cards, but it's really hard to put those in an envelope and send them in the mail. So a standard envelope that you'll find for like invitations, for example, is typically going to be an A2 size. You'll also find cards that are in a slightly bigger size, 5x7. So I don't ever make 5x7 cards, so I don't know what, I think that's called an A5. I could be wrong, but A2 is the card size that I'm going to be always making in my videos. So that's just a point of reference for you guys. And then another term that you might see referenced is a card sketch. And a card sketch is when you are referring to a layout or an already existing design for a card. And then you're pulling those elements or dimensions from that sketch to either take inspiration from or copy directly and exactly what you're seeing in that card sketch. So there might be a card sketch out there. In fact, this card layout design I lifted or borrowed, you might say, from I think it was May made it. She had some holiday cards and I loved the fact that she did that angled card. So I borrowed on that idea of the angled background card, angled background paper. But I added my own embellishments and did my own thing. I think if you're not making your cards to sell, or you're not blogging and trying to get like ad revenue from people who visit your blog, then I don't really know that there's anything wrong with borrowing someone else's design, as long as you're not profiting off of it and you give credit to the person you got the inspiration from. But at this point in the game, so many people have copied each other's designs or sketches that it can be really hard to tell where that comes from. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm not heavily involved in the card makers world, and some people might have really strong feelings about copying or reproducing a certain design and layout, and they may not want you to do that. So if you're going to copy someone's design or layout and they don't have it available for fair use or public use, and you're planning on making something to sell or you're going to promote it, then I would talk to that person before you use it and ask their permission before you even try to use it. So card sketches, A2 cards we talked about. The other thing that I frequently see people curious about is, what is a sentiment? And, a sentiment is like an emotional term, but it can also mean the writing on the card or the message on the card. In this case, the sentiment on this card says, "Thanks, you're sweet. On this card, it just says happy birthday. It's really simple. And on this one, it just says Dear Santa. Some people put their sentiments on the inside of the card, and then they decorate the outside, but don't put the sentiment on the outside. So everyone has a different style or method for putting their sentiments. You'll also see people refer to sentiments when you're looking at stamps, that some stamps come in a package of nothing but sentiments, or the kind of purpose of the stamp set is to just be a set of mostly sentiments and maybe a few cute shapes. And I have some examples of that I can show right now. Alright, so here's an example of a sentiment stamp set that has nothing but messages or wording on it, and it doesn't have any real decorative elements. There's like one or two little swirlies in here, but for the most part it's all text and not animals or photos or pictures or whatever. Here's another example, and this one is all text. There's a couple, like I said, there's a couple little embellishment flowers and stuff, but everything in here is just a variety of messages. If you're first getting started with stamping, I would encourage you to invest in, if you're going to be wanting to create the type of cards that have sentiments. And in my case, I don't have handwriting that I think is worthy of putting on a card, let's say on the front side maybe. So I wouldn't probably trust in my calligraphy skills or my handwriting skills, and I would probably prefer to invest in a sentiment stamp. But it also just saves you time from having to write on every card, especially if you're doing cards in bulk. So I have invested in a couple of different sets that I use heavily, but in the beginning I just bought a couple of wood stamps from, like the cheap section at the craft store, and then I added onto them as needed. So at the beginning I just had a couple of, like a thank you, a happy birthday, a sympathy stamp, and a congratulations stamp. And I have added to those over time. But those are the basics. Those are the types of cards I typically send. In addition to a sentiment, you will also see embellishment referred to. And an embellishment can be a lot of different things. In this card, the embellishments are the gems on the card and the sequin that's on the card. But on top of that, the embellishment is also this little glitter that's on the card. That's a pen that was brushed on, like a liquid glitter. You'll also see this type of embellishment is washi tape, and that is just a roll of tape that you can buy, and it usually comes in a package. And you might buy it in a package of like 3 or 6, or in like a tube of a bunch of them, or you can even get a big box of them. But you can get them in most craft stores. You can get them at the Dollar Tree. It just depends on whether or not you think you're going to use them. Don't buy a bunch of things if you're not sure if you're going to like it. Try it out with 1 or 2 and then expand on that. If you get a few colors that you think you'll get a lot of use out of, that's going to be a better fit than having a bunch of stuff. And this card doesn't really have any embellishment because the decorative element is already on the card. But some other types of embellishments that you might see besides gems or sequins might be like glitter glue dots. I think I have a couple of examples of that. So this is a card with some glitter glue dots that I just dotted on with one of these type of glitter glues. And you can get all different brands. There's different variety of prices available and different colors, but when it dries kind of flat. If you're going to be sending cards in the mail, then I would prefer putting something that's going to be flat on my card rather than something that's going to pop up. So that's why a lot of times I might use a little glitter dot. I might also put a glitter dot on there if I think the card just needs a little something extra. So there's that. Here's another example. I tend to do it in dots of 3, and I think that looks nice. So that's one of the things that I add. This would also be an example of an embellishment. There's a sticker on here, and then the sticker is backed onto a punched out circle, and then backed onto a little scalloped circle. These are frequently referred to as die cuts. If you want to get a couple of punch or cutters that will cut out a shape, those are really helpful, but you can also buy a die cutting machine. There's a lot of different kinds out there on the market, so do your research before you buy and invest in one, because there's so many different companies that make dies or the equipment to put through your die cutting machine. So you want to be able to get something that is going to work with any variety of dies and not be stuck with a set of dies that doesn't run through your machine. So these were just punched out with a circle punch that I have 2 different circle punches that nest nicely. And then the sticker obviously is just an embellishment. When you have some kind of embellishment like this where you layer it, sometimes the back layer is called a mat. And that is also something that you can see on this card, where the main image is backed on a colored cardstock. And in card making, you would call that matting your card elements, or matting your piece, or putting a mat on your piece. And then there's another example here with these banners, and I matted the top banner on this green cardstock to give it a little bit of emphasis and pull it off the page. And oftentimes that's done because if you don't have a mat behind your main image on your card, it gets lost in the background. If you have a really busy paper, if you have something that's very simple, like in this case, this is just a white background, and if I had just stuck the white paper on a white background, it would have just sort of blended in and lost the emphasis. So this mat gives it a little bit of emphasis, just like if you're matting a photo in a picture frame. It draws the eye into what's on the inside, or it pulls the eye. In this case, it kind of pulls the eye this way. So that's just one example, or a couple of examples of a mat. And then in this case, this circle is matted on this scalloped circle to help it float up to the front. So we've gone through A2, card sketch, sentiment, mat, embellishment. Next on the list is cardstock and paper. Cardstock is going to be a type of paper that is on the thicker side. As you can see, it's not like really wobbly. It's kind of thick, and you can hear the weight of it. And those are usually going to be papers that are going to have more density, I guess is what I would say. They can hold up better in the mail, and they are sturdier so that when you put another piece of paper or a thin piece of paper on top of it, it can support the extra weight, especially if you're adding multiple layers onto your card, gems, glitter, glue, other types of adhesives. And some people get really into layering their cards, and they do, 7 or 8 layers on top of their cards. So you want to have something, a cardstock, that can carry that weight and hold up well and not get really bent under the weight of all that. So you wouldn't want to use just a regular piece of construction paper. Although it is a little thicker and a little sturdier, it's just not going to have the density. I think it's the fiber structure of the construction paper that it's a little bit looser and it's easier to tear than a piece of cardstock. And I mean, most of us have seen or gotten a card, and you know the thickness of a card is able to go through the mail and not withstand a ton of damage through the mail. It maybe gets a little scraped, maybe gets a little bent or a little tweaked, but overall it's still in the exact same shape it was sent in. It's not gonna have a bunch of missing corners or be ripped off because the fiber was so delicate that it broke off like a piece of construction paper would be. So you can buy regular papers that are not on the thick side, like that are not cardstock, to decorate your cardstock with, or even just use magazine cutouts or junk mail cutouts, whatever you have to put on top of your cards as decorative papers or something that would be an embellishment. But I wouldn't use that as the main card because it is, again, not thick enough to withstand going through the mail or having things adhered onto it. So those are papers. I'm going to make a whole other video on different types of paper that I would recommend for someone who's just getting started. So the other thing I want to talk about is adhesives. And with adhesives, I'll be making a whole other video on that as well, but there are some terms that you'll see when you're watching videos, and one of them is an ATG or ATG gun, sometimes it's called, and that is referring to something that has a trigger, a gun-like trigger to release the tape onto your card or whatever it is that your element that you're adding to your card. I have an example here. So this is my advanced tape glider. You might also hear it called adhesive transfer gun. This one happens to be made by Scotch brand. And what happens is the tape is wound around, and when you drag it, you hold down the trigger and you drag it across the cardstock, it's going to leave a trail of sticky. So you can see that here it's kind of got the tape on the edge here, and when I run it down, it's going to stick. So that's one type of method of delivering glue to your cards that is going to be flat, and it's not going to leave a lot of wetness behind, so your cardstock will remain intact and won't warp or bend, because a liquid glue can sometimes do that, and even glue stick can sometimes do that depending on how thick or thin your papers are. Another thing that you might hear frequently referred to is something called a tape runner, or I've heard it called a snail before, and I have a few different versions of that. I'm going to show you just a couple of versions here. Alright, so this one I don't have glue inside of right now, but this is an Elmer's tape runner. You buy a little cartridge and you put it in the inside here, you open it up, and then you put it on the inside. I don't have any right now. That's one brand. This is a brand called ThermoWeb. It's a tape runner XL, memory tape runner XL, permanent bond. It's the same idea as the big tape gun. It's just that instead of having to pull a trigger with your finger, you're just pressing with the pressure of your adhesive runner to get the glue coming out, or the trail of glue, I guess, the tape coming out. This is my favorite one. It is called Tombow Mono Dots Adhesive. I prefer the dots to the non-dot adhesive that's just a straight sticky strip. I just find to get a better application from it, but try out whatever you can find in your craft store. I'm sure they all work exactly the same, and there's a lot of variety out there. And then this one is just one that I found at the Dollar Tree, and it worked just as well. It has a little piece that, pulls away so that it can be released, but I think this one I ran out. So just go out there and see what you can find. I do also like to use other types of glue, but these are just when somebody is referring to snail or tape runner, that's what they mean. Something like this where it's like a little tape or glue delivery tool. And really this is kind of like a similar item to a double stick tape, which if you've ever used double stick tape, that works just as well. It's just a different type of delivery system, and it makes it a little bit more one-handed or automatic so that you don't have to peel it off and measure it and stuff like that. It's just a little bit simpler and easier if you're making cards. But if you find that double-sided tape is easier to find in your area or easier for you to acquire, then use that. There's nothing wrong with it. And then I see a lot of people talking about things like pop dots or dimensionals on cards. I don't have any good examples of that right here, so I'll go grab one. Alright, so this is an example of how a dimensional would come. Either you got it in a roll like this, and then you just tear a piece off or cut a piece off. It has removable liners so that you can, it's basically double stick tape but with a piece of foam between the two double stick sides, so that way you can glue it down to your base and then stick something on top of it. I'll show you what that looks like, but that's just one version. Another option that I've found is 3D dots or pop dots, and it tells you how thick or thin they are. You can find a lot of different varieties. And then this one was just like foam squares that I got. Some people will end up using craft foam and then use a liquid glue to adhere things down to it, but I've never used that. I've never tried that, and I don't know how well it works. So if you're a beginner and you want to try using dimensional adhesives, then I would just probably go with whatever is easier for you to find in a local craft store for you. I've had good luck with using this, but I find that it's bigger and it's harder for me to store, so I tend to not reach for it, and these ones are easier for me to put right at my fingertips and grab, so I tend to just use these more. But it's a personal preference. And then when you're using those dimensional adhesives or pop dots, what you'll get when you apply them to your card is you'll get this 3D effect. So on this card, I have my card, decorative paper, and then I have a little banner. I have a mat and my sentiment. I used embellishments to add glitter glue onto my little sticker, and then I added some gems. But before I glued this matted sentiment down, I put some 3D adhesive underneath, and that way it just gives it a raised effect off of the card. So that's one example. And this is an example where I did it in reverse. So I'll just compare the two for you. So this one, I popped, or this is a different one I think, but I popped this one up off my page. And on this case, I left a little punch out. I actually punched it out and then stuck it down. So it has this little sticker in the empty punch area, and thought that would be a creative way to make it look like almost like this is making me hungry and I want to take a little bite of that cupcake, and then somebody took a little bite out of this birthday wishes banner. At least that's the idea I was going with at the time. And then you can see that there's like a 3D effect with that glue, kind of foam glue tape. So just going to put those aside. But that's an example of how you would use in a dimensional or a pop dot. I tend to not use them as much because right now I'm making cards that can go in the mail because it's COVID after all, and I'm not seeing very many people, and I don't want to be making a bunch of cards that I can't actually use. So that's what I'm doing. You'll also see people referring to something called embossing. And an embossing technique, there's two ways of doing it. You have a heat emboss, which means that you're using a powder. And with the powder, you need to have some kind of liquid or some kind of ink that you stamp onto your page, and then you apply your powder to that, and then you use a heat gun or a heat tool to heat up the powder, and it changes the texture of the powder. It kind of liquefies, and then it dries quickly. I don't have any examples of embossing right here with me right now, and I have the tools, but I don't use it very often, so I probably won't give you an example to show in this video. But you can Google heat embossing, or you can look it up on YouTube and find some images or some screenshots or some live videos of people making those heat embossed cards. It's a really fun technique, but it does require a significant investment because you have to buy the heat gun, you have to buy the embossing powder, and you have to buy the ink specifically for embossing. It's a really sticky type of ink. So for me, that's kind of like a barrier to entry for a new person. So I wouldn't go with that type of embossing, but there is another type of embossing that is called dry embossing. And that's a type of embossing that you can use either some kind of an embossing folder, which you can buy with all different kinds of designs on them, or you can use a little stylus. So here I have a couple of examples of embossing folders, and the way that these work is you sandwich your paper between the folder, and in this case there is a dot image that's raised, and then on the other side there's a dot image that's like embedded or impressed in. So when you put your paper through inside of this and then you run it through a press, it will leave a image of that dots. On one side it'll be pushed in, on the other side it'll be pushed out, and then you can use it however you want. If you want the pushed in part sticking up on your card, or the pushed out part to add texture, which is what most people do. And this one just happens to be made by a brand called Cuttlebug. That's the type of cutter or the type of press that I have. I don't use them very often, but I really like the way it looks, and it's a nice way to add some texture to a card without having to add get that dimensional tape or dimensional dots. But it's also a way to add some visual interest to a card that's kind of plain or has a plain background. So this one has got like a music notes pattern on it. And it can be really nice to have something like this to add a little bit of interest, but these can be a little expensive, and if you're not sure if you're going to use them, or if you're not sure if you're going to like it, it's cost prohibitive because you need to also have the press. And the press is a pretty expensive tool if you're just getting started. I wouldn't recommend getting those, but maybe borrow one or see if your local library or makerspace has one that you can use to see if it's something that you would want to invest in. Some people really like them. It just depends on the person. You know, everybody's different. So that's an example of an embossing folder. This is not the same thing as a heat emboss. A heat emboss would be using a powder that you heat up, and it will be kind of a permanent effect, kind of like what this gold foil has. This gold foil was heat applied. It's not done with embossing powder, but it's a similar concept. Another thing that is referred to pretty frequently when you're using stamps or when you're doing any kind of inking is something called masking. And masking just means that you want to block off part of your stamp so that it doesn't get inked onto your card. So typically what people do when they're masking is they use something like a sticky note or something that has a sticky that's removable to block off part of their, either part of their background on their card, and then they stamp so that it leaves a clean edge, or they actually put this on the stamp after they've before they've inked it so that it doesn't, you know, put the ink down. But typically I see people applying this to the card, and some people will even go as far as doing like layers of masking to get a really decorative or fancy effect when you have multiple layers of stamping and you want to block off some things and have some things look like they're in the background, and you're doing layers of stamping and you need to have something cut out in a certain shape. A lot of times I see people using a sticky note, or some people even buy products specifically for masking that are called like masking papers that have the adhesive or that sticky post-it note glue on the back of the entire page. It's not something that I do too frequently. I just tend to keep simple cards, simple techniques. But there's a lot of videos out there for people who do a lot of inking. One person to look for is Jennifer McGuire Ink. She does a ton of ink-based videos and stamping-based videos. And another person is Christina Warner. She does a lot of inking and a lot of masking and stamping. So those would be good people to watch if you're interested in learning that technique. But it's a pretty simple technique and it doesn't require a lot of materials. As long as you already have the inks and the stamps, it can be a cool way to get more out of your stamps, out of your already existing stamp sets, by just adding a post-it note, which most of us have around. We either get them in the hotels or, wherever you stay, or you have a couple of stacks of them around from, working from home, probably. At least I do. And I tend to just stock up on that kind of thing because I use post-it notes all the time. So another thing that I would say I see a lot is, besides masking, is the type of stamp. When you're inking or when you're doing anything with, like in this case, this sentiment was stamped, this image was stamped. And what I see a lot of people referring to with the stamps is the type of stamp material that's used. One type of stamp material is a wood stamp or wood-backed stamp, or a rubber stamp is something that you see a lot. That's a traditional stamp. I have some examples to show you. All right, so here's an example of a wood block stamp, rubber stamp. It's a little dirty because I've used it and I've had it for a really long time. This one just happens to have a wood grain pattern. It's a really nice stamp. It's a big stamp, so usually I can get like a whole background out of it, which is nice. You don't have to buy a stamp like this, and these types of stamps that are this size are usually pretty expensive. And when I say expensive, I just mean compared to other types of stamps. I think expense is subjective, because when I was starting out, I felt like spending more than $5 on a particular tool for my hobby was a little bit more of an investment than I was interested in making at the time, because I wasn't sure if I was going to keep those tools for a long time or not find a way to use them, or not get what I wanted out of them, not get their value out of them. And so you kind of have to weigh whether or not you're going to get a good return on your investment, whether or not you're going to get a lot of use out of it. So I always recommend starting small. Looking and seeing if you can find things in a thrift store is a way that I find so many of these rubber stamps, because people end up destashing. You can find lots of destash groups on Facebook or Instagram, probably. I haven't looked there, but start small and see if you like it, and then move your way up. Here's a couple of other wood block stamps. I'm pretty sure both of these I got either in the dollar section at Michael's, or something similar. Like, they were really cheap. This is just a wooden stamp with butterflies on it, and then this is a sentiment stamp, get well soon, and they're stuck on. They have glue on the back, but some people buy stamps that don't have any wood block on them. They're just the actual like foam piece with the rubber on it. You can find some stamp sets like that, and I do have an example of that. I don't know what they're called, but they're not rubber backed, but they're still rubber stamps. So this is a set, happens to be a set as part of the Tim Holtz collection by Stampers Anonymous. It's kind of like a old school or vintage looking stamp set. And here's an example of the stamp, one of the stamps in the set. It is a rubber stamp. You can see it's the same pink rubber as this. It's the same kind of gray foam on the back. But in this case, instead of having a foam piece, you just either wet the back and stick it against an acrylic block and use that to stamp it down, or you have something else that you can attach it to, but usually people are attaching it to an acrylic block. And I can show you one of those when I show you. The other type of stamp that you can get besides a rubber stamp is a photopolymer stamp, or also they're referred to as clear stamps. So I'll show you some of those. All right, so I showed you these earlier when I was talking about my sentiment stamps, or stamps that just have text. But this is a good example of a photopolymer or clear stamp, and it's made out of basically a kind of plastic almost. When you take these clear stamps out of this plastic wrapping, you have to stick them down onto some kind of what's called an acrylic block. These are sold separately typically. You can sometimes find them in a set with the actual stamps, but I find it kind of rare, and usually the acrylic blocks are kind of on the small side. So if you're getting bigger stamps or bigger clear stamps, you may want to invest in a larger sized acrylic block. I personally find that I don't use the really large acrylic stamps. I tend to get the smaller ones. So I do have a bigger block, but I don't use it. And I tend to I have acquired a handful of the small ones. I'm pretty sure I got a couple of these small ones at like in the dollar section of a Michael's, or maybe even at the Dollar Tree. So when you're taking this off the background here, you just peel it off gently, and it's very flexible and a little sticky, and then you should be able to just stick it down on your acrylic block. And a lot of people will try to put it down on their mat, on their background, where they have something to align it with, a ruler of some kind to keep it straight, and then you ink it up and you see through the acrylic so you can exactly line it up where you want to on your card and stamp it down to get a perfectly placed image. The nice thing about this type of thing is if you are able to see through it, you can see whether or not your stamp is going to get off the edge. When you're doing something like this, you can't really tell. So I have a couple of techniques to prevent me from going off the edge, and one of those techniques is just stamping on a piece of blank paper and then cutting out around it to make sure that I don't end up going off my edge. But there's a few other things that you can do. There's some tools that will help you place your paper in so that you don't ever go off the page, and you can have basically an alignment tool. There's a few other products out there for that, but I only have one of those products, and it's called the Misty tool. And I might show that to you in another video and talk about it when I'm talking about my inks and my stamping, but I don't think that's something that everyone needs. So I have a stamp positioner that I made years ago with Legos, and I'll show you that when I go through the video on inks and stamping. But for now, I just want to show you clear or photopolymer stamps, what those look like, and how you use them with an acrylic block. I think the only other topic I had in here has to do, or my terminology has to do with fussy cutting and what that means. I've seen that referred to a lot, and fussy cutting is going to refer to cutting something out really delicately. Let's say that I have this stamp that's a chandelier, and I've stamped it on my paper, and I want to cut out exactly around the border of the chandelier and then stick it down onto something. And I don't want it to be, just a square or a rectangle around that. So when I want to get really close to it or create a little border edge, that's called fussy cutting. And you'll see that a lot. People use smaller sized scissors to do that type of cutting. And I'm not going to demonstrate it here, but I have an example of something I fussy cut. I drew and fussy cut my own little flower just so you could see what that means. Because it's not, I'm not a great artist. I don't draw well, but it was just a little doodle sketch, and then I cut with my scissors all the way around it. There's lots of videos that talk about fussy cutting as a technique, and I'm not particularly good at it, so I'm not going to demonstrate it here, but you can look at those videos if you're interested in fussy cutting. It does require having a small, sharp pair of scissors. It's not something that's easily done with a X-Acto knife, so I wouldn't even attempt to do some fussy cutting unless I had a small, sharp pair of scissors, because you're just an exercise in futility. But if you see fussy cutting referred to in videos or on blogs, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about cutting really closely or creating a little border around either a stamped image, or sometimes it's just an image you cut out of a magazine, or sometimes it's cut out of cardstock, like a specific image you want to cut out of a piece of cardstock. So I think I've gone through just about, not quite. I also wanted to talk about scoring, and along with scoring, bone folders. So scoring is something that you will have to do when you have a piece of cardstock that isn't folded in half, and scoring is often done to get a better fold. And you'll see people argue about what's the best tools for scoring, and there's certain types of tools out there that you can buy it's a whole entire mat so that you can score at different lengths. But you can also just score with a bone folder, or with your, even with your, maybe your fingernail on something. But here's an example of a scoring tool. So this is a Martha Stewart scoreboard, and it has a little pop-up here where you can store your bone folder, and when you place your paper into the tool, you can line it up and mark it with this line here, that's inches, and then I can go ahead and use my folder to score it, or roll my tip of my bone folder against that paper, and that creates a little indent on the back side of this paper. It's pushed out. There's a big argument on the internet about which way you should score your cards to get the right type of fold, and I don't really have a preference, but in my experience, not scoring a card can create some problems when you fold it. Sometimes the paper, if it's really thick, it might crack. So I do recommend getting a bone folder if you're going to be making your own card bases. But if you are not going to be making your own card bases, if you're going to purchase them pre-made, I wouldn't worry about getting a tool like this whatsoever. I might suggest investing in a pretty decent bone folder, not a little tiny plastic one like this that's getting all chewed up from years worth of use. I have a better bone folder, and it's called a bone folder because it's made out of bone. So here is an actual bone folder, and this has really got a point on one end to be able to score a line into your paper right along that seam, or wherever it is you want to fold it over. And a lot of people use other types of tools to help get a perfect alignment, because you want to make sure that your score is not going to go off on a jagged edge and then ruin your fold of your card. And then you also have this little rounded edge here, And a lot of times when you're folding a card or you're scoring a card, you'll use this to sort of burnish the card edge down to sort of flatten it on the fold. So that's just how I tend to use it. It's a really helpful tool, but it's not a required tool, especially if you are not making your own card bases or not doing a lot of card making that requires folding. Like if you're doing any kind of fancy fold cards, if you're doing any kind of cards that have like a gate fold instead of a just a hinge like this, if you're doing something that opens up from the center, then you might need to get a bone folder if you're creating your own custom card shapes like that. I wouldn't suggest getting a bone folder if you're not doing something like that, because it'll just sit around gathering dust and you'll feel guilty for having it and not using it. So one last thing that I'll mention is die cuts. And die cuts are things that you can either create yourself using either dies that you purchase in a certain shape and run it through your own press. In my case, I have what's called a Cuttlebug, and it can do both embossing and die cutting. Most of them can. Most of those tools can do both. Some people use Cricut for die cutting, and it comes with like pre-assigned software, or it has a software that has some pre-designed images in it. You can also buy metal plates that you have in a series of nested shapes. I have an example here to show you. This would be an example of a die, and when you use the die, it will cut along this raised edge here. As you run it through your press, you have to have some special plates when you run it through your press so that you don't damage your press. Usually it's like an acrylic plate, by the way. Not an acrylic block, but a plate that goes across the whole paper. And then when you use it, it's going to cut the inside piece out of your paper. And sometimes that's helpful if you're trying to make batch cards, or if you're trying to make a bunch of the same shape, or you want everything to be kind of lined up where, let's say I wanted this to be layered onto this other rectangle. It would be a perfectly symmetrical shape if I layered them together with a perfect amount of space around the border. So I would be able to get a perfect 1/8 inch border if I cut both of these rectangles out of different colored paper, for example. Sometimes you'll find kits or sets that come with a stamp and a matching die, and those can be cool, but if you don't have a die cutting machine or a press like I'm talking about, it's not going to be a good value for you. So let me give you an example. These are a couple of kits or sets that I got. I think I got this one last year or 2 years ago, probably. I haven't used it just because, actually I might have used this little tiny heart before, but it has a little cat that you can stamp and then cut out, and then it has a little heart for the little paw. So these 4 other stamps don't have a matching die to cut it out, and then it does tell you which types of tools it will work with. So it does work with a Spellbinder, a Cuttlebug, and a Sizzix press or die cutting machine. So that's just an example. Here's another example where it comes with the stamps and the die. I'm sorry that it has so much hair. I have a cat and his hair just gets everywhere. But this has got a little cactus die, and then it would be stamping this image and then cutting it out. But it kind of sucks because I don't have the dies for all of these other ones. So while I got it because I was excited about it, not having the other dies to match has discouraged me from using it. But don't let that discourage you. I would just recommend when you're getting something make sure it's something you're going to use and that it's going to be a good value for you. If you are like me and you get one of these, find you haven't used it, and then see another one and think back to the one that you have already and haven't touched, don't buy the second one because you won't touch that one either. So this is on my to-do list of making stuff. That's not really part of this video, but I did want to tell you there's a difference in quality for sure when you buy a cheapy brand. This is like Michael's brand, and the Recollections brand too, I think is a Michael's brand. There's a big difference in quality of the cut or the quality of the shapes and how they align with the stamps when you buy, the budget-friendly dies versus, the brand dies that are all nested. And sometimes you will get some duds. Sometimes you'll get some that don't really cut out very well, or your pressure is off on your machine, so you might have to experiment. There are a lot of videos about die cutting, and I probably won't be making a video about it unless I get a lot of requests, but and I only have one particular type of machine, but sometimes you just got to play with the pressure to get the right cut through different types of paper, because every paper is of different thickness. So there's something to keep in mind. It may not come out perfectly, and you have to be okay with that because it's art. So that's what dies are. You can also buy die cuts that come in a little set or like a kit. Sometimes card making supplies come in a kit with matching paper and matching die cuts so that you can just glue them down onto your card or whatever it is, your scrapbooking page. And that can be nice because it's all matching and there's no harsh colors or harsh edges. It all kind of blends together. I think I might have an example of a couple of die cuts, but if nothing else, you can die cut like little circles out. You can do punches, and those are going to be pretty much the same thing as what you would find in something like this, where you can get punches in certain sizes, and you can get dies that have nested shapes so that you don't have to worry about buying 10 punches. If you want to have 10 different sizes, it might be more cost effective to buy the die set and then have your die cutting machine. If you feel like you're going to also be investing in doing a lot of die cutting, if you feel like you're going to be doing a lot of embossing, that might be a better way to go than investing in a bunch of punches, because they do take up a lot of space. That being said, the die cutting machine also takes up a lot of space, so there's a give and take there. So something to be aware of. Again, I would see if you can find a friend that you can borrow them from, or maybe the local makerspace or your library might have something that you can check out or borrow and see whether or not it's something you'd like. One last thing I think that I would want to mention is something that I see referred to a lot as DSP or DP, and that is just a reference to designer paper, or I sometimes will call it decorative paper, and that just means that it's a patterned paper. It has some kind of design on it. It's got some kind of maybe sometimes it's got texture or foiling. Sometimes it's got like shimmer on it. Here's an example of something that I've already got cut out, but it's got a pattern on it. It's also got like a pearly finish. So this would be a designer paper versus a plain cardstock, just a white, card base. So that's just something that I see people reference, that acronym DP or DSP, designer series paper is what it's sometimes called. And I feel like when I first started, I did not know what people meant until I kind of had to pick up the lingo. So designer paper or DP, DSP, you'll see it referenced, just means a paper with a decorative element on it, some kind of either either like a foiling like this, or maybe it's a glitter image or texture to it, or maybe it's got like some kind of shimmer or iridescent paper. It's got, there's lots of different variations that you'll see out there. But that's just something to keep out an eye out for, because people will refer to that, and sometimes it's like a whole other language that people will use. I think that's about all I have for this video as far as terminology goes, but I would love to know if you have any other questions about just basic card making terminology. I think I've covered for the most part what these things are and given you some good examples. But if there's more questions, leave me a comment. If you'd like me to make another terminology video, I'd be happy to do that. I will probably make a video specifically on different kinds of paper I recommend and don't recommend for card making specifically, not for scrapbooking, because I don't do scrapbooking anymore. I'll probably make a video on different kinds of inks and different kinds of stamps and tools for making a good imprint on a card, or tools for helping you clean your stamps, all the stuff related to stamping, because that's something I have a lot of experience with and I have a lot of tools. But there's some things that you don't have to go out and buy, that you can just use some basic materials that you can find at home or anywhere really without having to spend a lot of money. And then I would also like to make a video on different types of adhesives that exist out there and which ones I recommend for which scenarios and why. And also, budget friendly options, because not everyone wants to buy an ATG gun. I don't know that everybody is going to need an ATG gun. It's kind of a heavy duty tool for people who make a lot of cards. If you're like me and you make tons of cards, you do batches of like 50 cards, maybe that's a good fit for you. If you're not making 50 cards just on a whim, then maybe don't buy an ATG gun and just start with a snail, or the tape runner, or use a glue stick if that's good enough for you. If there's any other topics you guys have questions about with regards to card making, please let me know. I'd love to make a video that makes it really easy and accessible and beginner friendly. I mean very beginner friendly, because I know that when I started out, I just had to go to the store and talk to people in the aisles, and I know that that's not possible right now because most of us are sheltering at home and there's COVID and we're not really talking to strangers or going out and about. So you can ask me. I'm the stranger in the Michaels aisle that knows sort of what she's talking about. So you can leave me a comment, and then I will probably do another series like this about jewelry making and beading supplies and jewelry making supplies and tools, because I think that is the other area that I have a lot of experience with and recommendations on ways to get started with that cheaply and effectively without having to spend a lot of money. So keep your eye out for those videos. I'll put them in a playlist as well so that it's easy to find on my channel. And I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I hope that you've learned something. And I'll look forward to seeing your comments and questions. Thank you so much. Bye.